The floorboards creaked 13 times as Reverend Marcus Whitfield climbed the narrow stairs to the locked room above his chapel. Behind the door, something scratched against wood fingernails, worn to nothing, dragging across pine planks, stained dark with years of desperate clawing. This is the story of a girl whose only crime was asking too many questions about the God her father preached to a congregation that chose blindness over truth. 1881 brought bitter cold to Millhaven, Tennessee, a town carved from limestone hills where coal dust settled like guilt on every windowsill. The Methodist chapel sat at the town's heart, white clapboard walls that gleamed in summer sun but turned gray as bone when winter fog rolled in from the Cumberland River. Inside, Reverend Whitfield's voice boomed every Sunday morning, promising salvation to families whose hands were already stained with secrets they'd never confess. But it was the sounds from above the sanctuary that made the congregation shift in their pews. Scratching, tapping, sometimes a muffled cry that Reverend Whitfield explained away as settling wood or mice in the walls. The townspeople nodded and sang their hymns louder, drowning out what they pretended not to hear. Millhaven had always been a place where questions died young. The coal mines provided work, the chapel provided comfort, and Reverend Whitfield provided answers that nobody dared challenge. He'd arrived in 1878 with his 14-year-old daughter Sarah, a girl with eyes too bright for a preacher's child, and a habit of asking why God allowed suffering if he was truly merciful. Case file 3847, Davidson County Sheriff's Office, March 15, 1881. Complaint filed by Mrs. Dorothy Henley regarding sounds from chapel attic. Investigated. Reverend claims no knowledge of disturbances. The congregation learned quickly that Sarah's questions made her father's jaw tighten and his sermons grow longer. They watched as she grew thinner each Sunday, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink inward like a flower closing against frost. Her voice, once clear as church bells, became a whisper. Then, silence. By winter of 1880, Sarah Whitfield stopped appearing at services altogether. Sunday walls keep secrets. "Where's your daughter, Reverend?" Old Martha Keene had asked after Christmas service, her weathered hands clutching a hymnal. Whitfield's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Sarah has been called to deeper contemplation," he replied. "Some souls require more intensive guidance to find their path to redemption." The townspeople accepted this explanation because accepting was easier than questioning. Because questioning meant acknowledging the sounds that grew louder each week, scratching that followed the rhythm of desperate prayer, tapping that spelled out messages no one wanted to decode. 23 scratches. Always 23. Dr. Edmund Hayes had delivered Sarah Whitfield 16 years earlier. He'd watched her grow from a curious child who collected beetles and asked why flowers died into a young woman whose questions cut too deep for comfort. When he passed the chapel on his evening rounds, he counted those scratches 23 taps. Pause, 23 more. The same pattern Martha Keene heard. The same pattern that made the coal miners' wives cross themselves and hurry past. But Dr. Hayes was the only one who recognized what those 23 taps meant. The 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Tapped out in desperate Morse code by fingers that no longer had strength to knock. The winter of 1881 was the coldest in Tennessee memory. Ice formed on the inside of windows. Livestock froze in their stalls. And above the chapel sanctuary, something continued scratching, weaker now, but persistent as prayer itself. What would you do if you heard those sounds and knew their meaning? Would you climb those stairs? Would you ask the questions that needed asking? Or would you join the congregation in their willful deafness, drowning out truth with louder hymns? Because by March of 1881, the scratching had almost stopped, and that silence was infinitely more terrifying than any sound Sarah Whitfield had ever made. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story has already gotten under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover next will make those 23 scratches seem like whispers compared to the screams that no one in Millhaven was prepared to hear. Dr. Hayes pressed his ear against the chapel's outer wall at 10:15 p.m. on March 20th, 1881, listening to silence that screamed louder than any cry for help. The scratching had stopped 3 days ago, and the absence of sound carved a hole in his chest where certainty used to live. A physician's oath demands action when suffering calls, but what happens when an entire town conspires to muffle the voice of pain? The morning after Sarah's tapping ceased, Dr. Hayes sat in his surgery, reviewing patient files, but his mind kept returning to those 23 scratches. He delivered half the babies in Millhaven, set broken bones for coal miners, and closed the eyes of the dying. Never had he felt so powerless as when listening to that desperate Morse code prayer echoing from the chapel attic. His medical bag sat beside his desk, leather worn smooth by 40 years of house calls. Inside, alongside his stethoscope and surgical instruments, he carried a small notebook where he recorded unusual cases. The entry for March 17th read simply, Patient S.W. Suspected confinement, malnutrition, possible psychological distress, access denied by father, intervention required. But intervention meant confronting Reverend Whitfield, and Whitfield held power in Millhaven like a fist holds sand tight, crushing, absolute. The silence became a scream. Dr. Hayes had witnessed the gradual transformation of Sarah Whitfield over 3 years. The bright-eyed girl who'd once asked him why blood was red and bones were white had slowly dimmed like a candle burning down to its final inches. Her questions about God's nature, innocent curiosity about suffering and salvation, had earned increasingly harsh responses from her father. Children must learn submission before they can understand divine truth, Reverend Whitfield had explained when Dr. Hayes inquired about Sarah's absence from town gatherings. Some spirits require more, dedicated correction. The word correction hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match. Case file 3847, supplemental report March 21st, 1881. Dr. Hayes reports concerns about welfare of Reverend Whitfield's daughter. Requests welfare check. Reverend refuses entry, cites religious privacy. Martha Keene wasn't the only congregant who'd noticed the sounds. Coal miner Jacob Thorne heard them during Wednesday evening services. School teacher Ruth Mason counted the scratches during Sunday sermons. Even children whispered about the ghost in the church attic when they thought adults couldn't hear. But whispers weren't action. Counting wasn't intervention. And everyone in Millhaven had learned that questioning Reverend Whitfield meant questioning God himself, a sin too dangerous to contemplate in a town where the mines claimed lives and the chapel promised the only comfort available. Dr. Hayes understood the mathematics of complicity. 23 scratches repeated meant Sarah was alive, but weak. The sudden silence meant she was either dead or too weak to continue her coded prayers. Either possibility demanded immediate medical attention. On March 22nd, he made his decision. The chapel door was never locked. Reverend Whitfield proclaimed it a sanctuary open to all souls seeking redemption. Dr. Hayes entered at midnight, his medical bag in one hand and a lantern in the other. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and lingering incense, but underneath lay something else. The sour scent of unwashed bodies and human waste. Sunday walls keep deadly secrets. He found the narrow staircase behind the altar, hidden by a tapestry depicting Christ's ascension. Each step groaned under his weight, and he paused at the landing before a door secured with 3 heavy padlocks. Iron brackets held the locks in place, freshly installed based on the clean metal and lack of rust. Through a gap between floorboards, warm air rose proof someone lived in the space above. But no sounds emerged. No scratching, no tapping, nothing. Dr. Hayes pressed his mouth to the gap and whispered, "Sarah? Sarah? It's Dr. Hayes. I'm here to help." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then, so faint he almost missed it, came a whisper that barely qualified as sound. "Please, how long would you wait before breaking down a locked door? How many whispered pleas would it take to overcome your fear of consequences?" Dr. Nata consequences. Hayes faced that choice in a town where challenging authority meant exile, and exile meant death in the Tennessee mountains. But some choices make themselves, and as Dr. Hayes raised his lantern to examine those 3 padlocks, he discovered that Reverend Whitfield's dedication to his daughter's correction ran deeper than anyone in Millhaven had dared imagine. The first padlock snapped under Dr. Hayes's surgical bone saw at 12:47 a.m., the metallic crack echoing through the chapel like a gunshot in a graveyard. The second lock required his amputation knife used as a lever, and the third gave way to brute force and 40 years of steady hands that had never trembled until tonight. When sacred authority becomes a prison, sometimes the only moral choice is to become a criminal. The attic door swung open on hinges that screamed from disuse, releasing air so thick with human suffering that Dr. Hayes staggered backward. The smell hit him in layers: unwashed flesh, human waste, infection, and underneath it all, the sweet sick scent of starvation eating a body from within. His lantern cast dancing shadows across a space no larger than a horse stall. The ceiling sloped so low that Sarah couldn't stand upright, forcing her to remain crouched or prone. Scratches covered every surface, not random clawing, but deliberate marks carved by fingernails worn to bloody stumps. 23 vertical lines grouped in 5s, hundreds of them. A calendar of captivity scratched into wood by a girl counting days and prayers. Personal Journal, SDN. Dr. Edmund Hayes, March 23rd, 1881, found SW, in state of severe malnutrition. Weight approximately 70 pounds. Multiple lacerations on hands from scratching. Evidence of prolonged confinement. Father claims religious discipline. I call it attempted murder. Sarah Whitfield lay curled in the far corner, her body so thin that Dr. Hayes initially mistook her for a pile of discarded rags. Her dress, the same blue cotton she'd worn to her last public appearance 8 months earlier, hung on her frame like fabric draped over kindling. Her hair, once thick and auburn, had fallen out in patches, leaving raw scalp visible beneath sparse strands, but her eyes remained alert, bright, defiant. "Dr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice rustling like dead leaves. "I knew someone would come. I prayed every day for 23 psalms that someone would hear." The mathematics of her imprisonment became clear. 23 scratches for each psalm, repeated daily for 8 months. Over 5,000 individual marks carved into the wood around her prison. Each one a prayer. Each one a plea for rescue that went unanswered by every adult in Millhaven who chose deafness over action. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of screams. Dr. Hayes knelt beside her, his medical training warring with rage that threatened to consume his professional composure. Sarah's pulse was rapid and weak, her breathing shallow. Her hands were infected from constant scratching, and her legs showed signs of muscle atrophy from prolonged confinement in a space too small for proper movement. "Why?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sarah's laugh was a sound no 16-year-old should know how to make bitter, hollow, ancient. "I asked why God allowed children to suffer if he truly loved them. Father said, I needed to understand suffering before I could understand love. He said isolation would bring me closer to divine truth." Through the attic's single small window, Dr. Hayes could see Millhaven sleeping peacefully below. Families tucked safe in their beds, consciences clear because they'd chosen not to hear the sounds from above their place of worship. The coal miners who'd counted scratches during sermons. The mothers who'd noticed Sarah's absence from Sunday school. The children who'd whispered about ghosts in the chapel attic. All of them complicit. All of them guilty. Case File 3847. 2 Medical Report. March 23rd, 1881. Patient requires immediate hospitalization. Evidence of deliberate starvation, confinement, psychological torture. Recommend criminal charges against Reverend Marcus Whitfield. Dr. Hayes began the delicate process of moving Sarah from her prison. Every touch caused her to wince. Her bones were so close to the surface that even gentle handling brought pain. As he lifted her, something crinkled beneath his knees. Papers, hidden under loose floorboards where Sarah had torn up her own clothing to create padding. By lantern light, he read pages covered in her careful handwriting. A diary of imprisonment. Records of her father's visits, brief, silent appearances where he'd leave small amounts of food and water, just enough to sustain life, but never enough to restore strength. Descriptions of her attempts to pray, to find meaning in suffering, to reconcile the God of love she'd been taught about with the God of punishment her father represented. Day 127. Father says my questions prove Satan's influence. He says only through complete submission will I find salvation. I scratched psalms into the wood today. The Lord is my shepherd. But where is my shepherd now? What would you do if you discovered your spiritual leader was torturing his own child in the name of God? If you realized that every Sunday service you'd attended was happening directly below a girl slowly dying from neglect? Dr. M.M.A.M. Hayes faced that reality as he cradled Sarah's broken body, knowing that saving her meant destroying the faith of an entire community. But as he carried her down those narrow stairs, past the altar where Reverend Whitfield preached about divine love, Dr. Hayes made a discovery that would shake Millhaven to its limestone foundations. Sarah wasn't Reverend Whitfield's first victim, and her attic prison wasn't his only secret room. Dr. Hayes discovered the second locked door while carrying Sarah through the chapel's basement, her fevered whispers leading him past the coal furnace to a corridor he'd never noticed in 40 years of visiting the sick and dying in Millhaven. Behind oak planks painted to match the foundation stones, 3 more doors waited, each secured with the same heavy padlocks that had imprisoned Sarah above the sanctuary. Sometimes the most horrific discoveries come not from what we find, but from realizing how long we've been walking past hidden suffering without seeing it. Sarah's weight in his arms felt no heavier than a child's, but her knowledge weighed like lead in his chest. Between shallow breaths, she whispered directions. Second door. Emma Crenshaw. Been here since summer. Father said she needed correction for reading books about science instead of scripture. The lantern's flame danced across padlocks that gleamed with fresh oil and recent use. Dr. Hayes set Sarah down gently, supporting her against the stone wall while he examined the locks. Unlike the rust-streaked hardware that had secured Sarah's attic prison, these showed signs of regular maintenance. Someone visited these rooms frequently. The basement breathed with hidden suffering. Emma Crenshaw had vanished in July of 1880, supposedly sent to live with relatives in Kentucky after questioning why women couldn't become ministers if God created all souls equal. Her disappearance had raised fewer questions than Sarah's. Emma was an orphan ward of the church, with no parents to demand explanations and no family to miss her presence. Behind the first door, Dr. Hayes found a girl who'd once been Emma, now reduced to angles and shadows. Her red hair matted against a scalp marked by infection. She'd carved no scratches into her prison walls. Instead, she'd written mathematical equations and scientific formulas using charcoal scraped from the furnace grate, covering every surface with knowledge that had earned her imprisonment. Dr. Hayes? Emma's voice cracked like thin ice. Is it real? Or am I dreaming again? It's real, he whispered, though nothing about Millhaven felt real anymore. You're safe now. Personal Journal, SS. Dr. Edmund Hayes, March 23rd, 1881, 2:15 a.m. Found EC in basement cell. Severe malnutrition, Signs of prolonged isolation. Mental state appears intact despite physical deterioration. How many others? How long has this been happening? The second door revealed 14-year-old Mary Hutchins, who disappeared in September after asking why the Bible contained different accounts of the same events if Scripture was infallible. Her cell was smaller than the others, forcing her to remain in a permanent crouch. She'd stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through hand gestures that Dr. Hayes recognized as a crude sign language she'd created to maintain sanity and silence. Behind the third door lay empty shackles and scratch marks that spelled out a single word, repeated hundreds of times. Mercy. Dr. Hayes counted the scratches by lantern light, while Sarah leaned against him, her breathing growing more labored with each minute outside her prison. 1,473 repetitions of the same plea, each mark representing a day when mercy was requested and denied. Who was here? He asked Sarah. Rebecca Stone, she whispered. Father said she died of fever, but I heard her scratching the word for months before it stopped. Case file 3,847. Expanded investigation March 23rd, 1,881. Discovery of multiple basement cells suggests systematic imprisonment and abuse. Recommend immediate arrest of Reverend Whitfield. Contact state authorities. The mathematics of Reverend Whitfield's correction program became clear in the basement shadows. 3 girls imprisoned for asking questions. 1 girl possibly dead from neglect. All of them guilty of nothing more than intellectual curiosity in a town where questions were treated as sins requiring punishment. Dr. Hayes understood now why the congregation had learned to ignore sounds from above and below their place of worship. The scratching, the tapping, the muffled cries, they weren't ghosts or settling wood. They were children slowly dying for the crime of thinking independently. Faith became a weapon of silence. As he prepared to carry Emma and Mary from their cells, joining Sarah in his desperate rescue mission, Dr. Hayes heard footsteps above, heavy boots crossing the chapel floor, a door slamming, the unmistakable sound of someone discovering that Sarah's prison stood empty. Reverend Whitfield had returned from his midnight travels, and the broken padlocks told him everything he needed to know. His carefully constructed system of correction was collapsing, and Dr. Hayes faced a choice that would determine whether 3 girls lived to see dawn or joined Rebecca Stone in whatever fate had earned her 1,000 scratched pleas for mercy. Through the basement ceiling, Reverend Whitfield's voice echoed no longer the smooth baritone that delivered Sunday sermons, but something harsher, more primitive. He was calling Sarah's name, and each call grew angrier as silence answered back. What would you do if you realized the most trusted figure in your community was a monster hiding behind religious authority? If you discovered that every Sunday service had been conducted above and below places where children suffered in darkness? Dr. Hayes faced that reality while supporting 3 barely living girls, knowing that Reverend Whitfield would never allow them to leave alive. But as those heavy footsteps began descending toward the basement, Dr. Hayes made a discovery that revealed the true scope of Reverend Whitfield's operations. He wasn't working alone, and Millhaven's secrets ran deeper than hidden rooms and locked doors. Sheriff Thomas Bracken's lantern appeared at the basement entrance at 2:37 a.m., followed by the measured footsteps of a man who'd walked these hidden corridors before. His badge caught the light as he descended, but the expression on his weathered face held no surprise at finding Dr. Hayes crouched beside 3 starving girls in what should have been the foundation of God's house. When authority protects monsters instead of victims, the entire system becomes complicit in evil that masquerades as righteousness. "Evening, Doc," Sheriff Bracken said calmly, as if discovering a physician tending to imprisoned children was routine business in Millhaven. "Reverend Whitfield called about some property damage. Says you broke into his private rooms without permission." Dr. Hayes positioned himself between the sheriff and the girls, his medical bag clutched like a weapon. "Thomas, These children have been tortured, starved, imprisoned for months. This isn't property damage, it's rescue." Sheriff Bracken's laugh held no humor. "That's a mighty serious accusation against a man of God. Reverend Whitfield tells me these girls needed spiritual intervention. Says their families requested his help when secular methods failed to correct their rebellious nature." The lie rolled off Bracken's tongue with practiced ease, and Dr. Hayes understood that this conversation had been rehearsed. The sheriff wasn't here to investigate. He was here to contain a situation that threatened to expose Millhaven's carefully constructed conspiracy of silence. Evil wears a badge and calls itself order. Behind Dr. Hayes, Sarah struggled to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Bracken, you brought food sometimes. You knew we were here." The admission hung in the basement air, like smoke from a gutted building. Sheriff Bracken had been complicit from the beginning, delivering supplies to keep the girls alive, but never questioning their imprisonment. His role in Reverend Whitfield's system of correction extended beyond mere ignorance. He was an active participant. Case file 3847, final entry, March 23rd, 1881, 3:0 a.m. Sheriff Bracken arrived to arrest me for breaking and entering. No mention of victims. System compromised at highest levels. If this journal survives, know that Millhaven's leaders chose power over justice. Dr. Hayes had delivered Sheriff Bracken's 3 children, set his wife's broken arm after a horse accident, and treated his mother's consumption until her death 2 years prior. 30 years of friendship and professional respect dissolved in the lantern light as Bracken removed shackles from his belt, not to free the imprisoned girls, but to arrest their rescuer. "I'm sorry, Doc, but you've interfered with church business. Reverend Whitfield has legal authority over these wards. Their guardians signed papers giving him full discretion in matters of moral education." The paperwork existed. Dr. Hayes had no doubt. In a county where Reverend Whitfield's word carried more weight than law, signatures could be obtained through pressure, promises, or outright falsification. Emma Crenshaw had no living relatives to question her guardian's methods. Mary Hutchins's grandmother was too old and too poor to challenge a man of God. Sarah's mother had died when she was 12, leaving her father with absolute authority over her fate. Authority without accountability becomes tyranny dressed as salvation. As Sheriff Bracken approached with the shackles, Mary Hutchins spoke for the first time in months. Her voice was raw from disuse, but her words cut through the basement shadows like a blade through cloth. He said God wanted us to suffer like Jesus suffered, but Jesus chose his suffering. We never had a choice. The theological simplicity of her observation stopped both men in their tracks. A 14-year-old girl, half dead from starvation and imprisonment, had identified the fundamental flaw in Reverend Whitfield's justification for torture. Christ's sacrifice was meaningful because it was voluntary. These girls' suffering was meaningless because it was imposed by a man who confused his own sadism with divine will. Dr. Hayes made his decision as Sheriff Bracken hesitated, perhaps recognizing the moral weight of Mary's words. He would not allow these girls to be returned to their cells. He would not participate in a system that called child torture a religious exercise. "Thomas," he said quietly, "your own daughter asked questions about faith. She wondered last Sunday why women can't preach if they have souls equal to men. Are you prepared to hand her over to Reverend Whitfield for correction?" The sheriff's face went pale. His daughter Rebecca, named Dr. Hayes now realized, after the girl whose scratched pleas for mercy had filled the 3rd cell, was only 13 years old and blessed with the same intellectual curiosity that had doomed Sarah, Emma, and Mary. But before Sheriff Bracken could respond to that devastating question, footsteps echoed from above, accompanied by voices that revealed the true extent of Millhaven's conspiracy. Mayor Harrison's deep baritone mixed with the higher pitch of Judge Matthews and the measured tones of Banker Coleman. How many respected citizens knew about the basement cells? How many pillars of the community had chosen to protect their spiritual leader rather than the children he tortured? Dr. Sells. Hayes was about to discover that Reverend Whitfield's system of correction had support that reached into every corner of Millhaven's power structure. And as those footsteps descended toward the basement, Dr. Hayes realized that saving 3 girls might require exposing an entire town's complicity in evil that had hidden behind Sunday prayers and collection plate donations for longer than anyone dared admit. Mayor Harrison's polished boots struck the basement stones with the authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to decide other people's fates, while Judge Matthews carried a leather satchel that contained documents already prepared for whatever outcome this midnight gathering would produce. Banker Coleman brought the practical concern that had always driven Millhaven's decisions: how to protect the town's reputation, and more importantly, its economic interests. When an entire power structure depends on maintaining lies, truth becomes the enemy that must be eliminated by any means necessary. The 4 most powerful men in Millhaven formed a semicircle around Dr. Hayes and the 3 girls, their lanterns casting shadows that danced like demons on the basement walls. Each man's face showed the careful neutrality of practiced politicians. No shock at discovering torture chambers beneath their place of worship. No outrage at finding children reduced to living skeletons. They'd known all along. Edmund, Mayor Harrison began, using Dr. Hayes's first name to establish the intimacy that would make betrayal feel personal. You've created quite a problem tonight. These girls were receiving necessary correction for moral defects that threatened the spiritual health of our community. Dr. Hayes felt Sarah's hand clutch weakly at his sleeve as she struggled to remain conscious. Her breathing had grown more labored during the confrontation, and Emma had begun showing signs of delirium from exhaustion. Time was running out, but the men surrounding them spoke as if they had all night to debate philosophy. Justice delayed becomes justice buried. Reverend Whitfield has done remarkable work with troubled youth, Judge Matthews added, pulling documents from his satchel with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd prepared legal justifications for the unjustifiable. These girls' guardians voluntarily surrendered custody for spiritual rehabilitation, all perfectly legal under Tennessee religious freedom statutes. The papers were genuine. Dr. Hayes could see official seals and witness signatures in the lantern light. Emma Crenshaw's elderly guardian, pressured by church elders and promised financial support. Mary Hutchins's desperate grandmother, convinced that religious discipline would save her granddaughter from a life of rebellion. Even Sarah's custody had been legally transferred through documents filed after her mother's death. Banker Coleman spoke with the cold precision of a man who understood that scandals destroyed property values faster than flood or fire. Dr. Hayes, you're a respected member of this community. Your medical practice depends on trust and discretion. These girls have received appropriate care under religious authority. Any suggestion otherwise would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The threat was delivered with banker's politeness, but the message was clear. Expose Reverend Whitfield's torture chambers, and Dr. passed. Hayes would find himself without patience, without income, without a future in Millhaven or any other community that heard the story. Fear masqueraded as practicality. What about Rebecca Stone? Dr. Hayes asked, indicating the empty 3rd cell with its 1,000 scratched pleas for mercy. Where is she receiving her appropriate care? The silence that followed was answer enough. Reverend Whitfield stepped from behind the other men, no longer the smooth-voiced preacher who delivered Sunday sermons, but something harder and more primitive. His eyes held the flat certainty of a man who'd convinced himself that his cruelty served a higher purpose. Rebecca Stone died of fever during the winter of 1879, he said simply. Some souls are too damaged by sin to survive the purification process. Her death was God's will, not human failure. The casual admission of letting a child die hung in the basement air like smoke from a funeral pyre. No remorse, no acknowledgement of guilt, just the matter-of-fact explanation of a man who'd watched a 14-year-old girl scratch pleas for mercy into wood while he allowed infection and starvation to claim her life. Personal Journal, T. Dr. Edmund Hayes, March 23rd, 1881, 3:30 a.m. They admit Rebecca Stone died in custody. Call it God's will. 5 men who should protect children instead debate how to cover up murder. Millhaven is diseased beyond healing. Dr. Hayes looked at each man's face in turn, searching for some flicker of conscience, some recognition of the horror they were protecting. Mayor Harrison showed only political calculation. Judge Matthews displayed legal detachment. Banker Coleman radiated financial concern. Sheriff Bracken revealed shame mixed with resignation, and Reverend Whitfield wore the serene expression of a man absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. How would you respond if 5 powerful men stood between you and saving 3 dying children? If they offered you a choice between complicity and destruction, between keeping silent and losing everything you'd built in 40 years of serving your community? Dr. Hayes faced that choice while supporting Sarah's weight against his chest, feeling her heartbeat grow weaker with each passing minute. Behind him, Emma and Mary waited for salvation that might never come if he chose wrong. But as the town council prepared to present their final offer, silence in exchange for his freedom, complicity in exchange for his career, Dr. II, Hayes discovered that some choices had already been made for him by a girl who'd spent 8 months scratching prayers into wood, while trusted adults chose blindness over justice. Sarah Whitfield's hand pressed something small and sharp into Dr. Hayes's palm as the town council prepared their final ultimatum. A fragment of metal she'd worked loose from her cell's hinges during 8 months of imprisonment, filed to a razor edge against stone, and saved for this moment when silence would condemn her forever. Sometimes the weakest among us carry the sharpest weapons against injustice, and a dying girl's determination can cut through lies that powerful men have spent years constructing. Dr. Hayes, Mayor Harrison continued, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician delivering bad news. We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement. Your medical practice will receive the town's full support, including an exclusive contract for mine injuries. All we ask is your understanding that these girls received appropriate religious guidance, nothing more. The metal fragment bit into Dr. Hayes's palm. Sarah's final gift, sharp enough to cut the ropes that bound Millhaven's conspiracy of silence. She'd spent months planning for this moment, weakening her prison's structural supports, creating weapons from debris, preparing for an escape she knew might kill her, but could save others. Judge Matthews withdrew a prepared statement from his leather satchel, the parchment crackling in the basement dampness. Simply sign here, acknowledging that you found these girls receiving lawful religious instruction, and this unfortunate misunderstanding can be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Blood money wore the mask of legal documents. Dr. Hayes looked down at Sarah's face, pale as candle wax, but alive with fierce determination. Her lips moved in a whisper only he could hear. The others, in the woods, behind the mill. He didn't stop with us. The revelation hit Dr. Hayes like a physical blow. Reverend Whitfield's system of correction extended beyond the chapel basement. Other children, other victims, hidden in locations throughout Millhaven's surrounding forest. Sarah had seen them during brief moments when her father moved her between cells, heard their cries during the darkest nights when wind carried sound differently through the hills. Banker Coleman checked his pocket watch with the impatience of a man who had other business to conduct before dawn. Dr. Hayes, time is limited. Sign the statement. Accept our generous compensation and maintain your position as a respected member of our community. Or face the consequences of making wild accusations against men who've served Millhaven faithfully for decades. The consequences were clearly implied: professional destruction, social exile, possible criminal charges for breaking and entering, kidnapping, or whatever legal fiction Judge Matthews could construct to silence an inconvenient truth-teller. Personal Journal, A.M. Dr. Edmund Hayes, March 23rd, 1881, A.M. 40 A.M. They offer 30 pieces of silver for my silence. Sarah whispers of other victims hidden in the woods. How many children has this town sacrificed to protect its spiritual leader? How many more will die if I choose safety over truth? Sheriff Bracken shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his service revolver. Doc, my own daughter asks questions sometimes, but Reverend Whitfield says questioning faith is natural for children, says they grow out of it with proper guidance. The admission revealed Bracken's deepest fear that his own Rebecca might someday join Sarah, Emma, and Mary in those basement cells. But rather than protecting his daughter by exposing the system, he chose to believe that compliance would keep her safe. Dr. Hayes understood the mathematics of collective cowardice. Each man in that basement had children, grandchildren, young relatives who showed signs of intellectual curiosity. Each had chosen to believe that their compliance would protect their own families while sacrificing other people's children to Reverend Whitfield's definition of spiritual correction. Silence became their shared sin. As Dr. Hayes stared at the prepared statement, Sarah's metal fragment cutting deeper into his palm, Emma began speaking in delirium, reciting scientific formulas she'd scratched into her cell walls, mathematical proofs that had earned her imprisonment for questioning whether Genesis described literal truth or metaphorical meaning. Her voice grew stronger as fever burned through her weakened system, and her words echoed off the basement stones, like accusations delivered by truth itself. If God created natural laws that govern the universe, why would questioning those laws be sinful? Why would understanding creation be rebellion against the Creator? The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. A starving 14-year-old girl had identified the fundamental contradiction in Reverend Whitfield's theology, that curiosity about God's creation was somehow an offense against God Himself. What would you sign to save your own life? What signature would you give to preserve 40 years of work, reputation, and security? Dr. Hayes faced that choice while feeling Sarah's lifeblood seeping through the metal fragment she'd pressed into his palm. But as he raised the pen, Judge Matthews offered him, Dr. Pend. Hayes realized that Sarah had given him more than a weapon. She'd given him proof that even Millhaven's most powerful men couldn't explain away, evidence that would survive whether he signed their statement or not. Sarah Whitfield's hand pressed something small and sharp into Dr. Sal Hayes's palm as the town council prepared their final ultimatum. A fragment of metal she'd worked loose from her cell's hinges during 8 months of imprisonment, filed to a razor edge against stone, and saved for this moment when silence would condemn her forever. Sometimes the weakest among us carry the sharpest weapons against injustice, and a dying girl's determination can cut through lies that powerful men have spent years constructing. Dr. Hayes, Mayor Harrison continued, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician delivering bad news. We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement. Your medical practice will receive the town's full support, including an exclusive contract for mine injuries. All we ask is your understanding that these girls received appropriate religious guidance, nothing more. The metal fragment bit into Dr. Hayes's palm. Sarah's final gift, sharp enough to cut the ropes that bound Millhaven's conspiracy of silence. She'd spent months planning for this moment, weakening her prison's structural supports, creating weapons from debris, preparing for an escape she knew might kill her, but could save others. Judge Matthews withdrew a prepared statement from his leather satchel, the parchment crackling in the basement dampness. Simply sign here, acknowledging that you found these girls receiving lawful religious instruction, and this unfortunate misunderstanding can be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Blood money wore the mask of legal documents. Dr. Hayes looked down at Sarah's face, pale as candle wax, but alive with fierce determination. Her lips moved in a whisper. Only he could hear. The others, in the woods, behind the mill. He didn't stop with us. The revelation hit Dr. Hayes like a physical blow. Reverend Whitfield's system of correction extended beyond the chapel basement. Other children, other victims, hidden in locations throughout Millhaven's surrounding forest. Sarah had seen them during brief moments, when her father moved her between cells, heard their cries during the darkest nights when wind carried sound differently through the hills. Banker Coleman checked his pocket watch with the impatience of a man who had other business to conduct before dawn. Dr. Hayes, time is limited. Sign the statement, accept our generous compensation, and maintain your position as a respected member of our community. Or face the consequences of making wild accusations against men who've served Millhaven faithfully for decades. The consequences were clearly implied: professional destruction, social exile, possible criminal charges for breaking and entering, kidnapping, or whatever legal fiction Judge Matthews could construct to silence an inconvenient truth-teller. Personal Journal, Dr. Edmund Hayes, March 23rd, 1881, 40 a.m. They offer 30 pieces of silver for my silence. Sarah whispers of other victims hidden in the woods. How many children has this town sacrificed to protect its spiritual leader? How many more will die if I choose safety over truth? Sheriff Bracken shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his service revolver. Doc, my own daughter asks questions sometimes, but Reverend Whitfield says questioning faith is natural for children, says they grow out of it with proper guidance. The admission revealed Bracken's deepest fear that his own Rebecca might someday join Sarah, Emma, and Mary in those basement cells. But rather than protecting his daughter by exposing the system, he chose to believe that compliance would keep her safe. Dr. Hayes understood the mathematics of collective cowardice. Each man in that basement had children, grandchildren, young relatives who showed signs of intellectual curiosity. Each had chosen to believe that their compliance would protect their own families while sacrificing other people's children to Reverend Whitfield's definition of spiritual correction. Silence became their shared sin. As Dr. Hayes stared at the prepared statement, Sarah's metal fragment cutting deeper into his palm, Emma began speaking in delirium, reciting scientific formulas she'd scratched into her cell walls, mathematical proofs that had earned her imprisonment for questioning whether Genesis described literal truth or metaphorical meaning. Her voice grew stronger as fever burned through her weakened system, and her words echoed off the basement stones like accusations delivered by truth itself. If God created natural laws that govern the universe, why would questioning those laws be sinful? Why would understanding creation be rebellion against the Creator? The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. A starving 14-year-old girl had identified the fundamental contradiction in Reverend Whitfield's theology, that curiosity about God's creation was somehow an offense against God Himself. What would you sign to save your own life? What signature would you give to preserve 40 years of work, reputation, and security? Dr. Hayes faced that choice while feeling Sarah's lifeblood seeping through the metal fragment she'd pressed into his palm. But as he raised the pen Judge Matthews offered him, Dr. Spard, Hayes realized that Sarah had given him more than a weapon. She'd given him proof that even Millhaven's most powerful men couldn't explain away. Evidence that would survive whether he signed their statement or not. Dr. Hayes set the pen down without signing and pulled Sarah's metal fragment from his palm, revealing not just a weapon but a key, filed to match the profile of every padlock in Reverend Whitfield's system of correction, created during months of patient observation as her father secured and resecured her prison door. When the powerless refuse to surrender their last breath to injustice, they become more dangerous than armies, because dying people have nothing left to lose and everything left to expose. The key's significance struck the 5 men simultaneously. Sarah hadn't just endured her imprisonment, she'd studied it, mapped its weaknesses, and created the means for other victims to escape. Every lock in the basement, every hidden room Reverend Whitfield had constructed for his twisted ministry, could be opened by a fragment of metal worn smooth by a 16-year-old girl's desperate hope. "You underestimated her, Dr. Thing," Hayes said, holding the key where all 5 men could see it. "All of you. You thought starving children would be too weak to fight back. But Sarah's been planning this rescue for months." Mayor Harrison's political composure cracked like thin ice. "That proves nothing. A piece of metal, wild accusations from delirious children. No court would what?" Dr. Hayes interrupted. "Judge Matthews, you carry those legal documents because you know this system exists. Sheriff Bracken, you brought food to these cells because you knew children were imprisoned here. Banker Coleman, you calculated the financial cost of exposure because you knew there was something to expose." Truth cut through lies like Sarah's key through metal. Emma's delirium had cleared enough for her to stand, supporting Mary, who remained too weak to walk alone. Together, the 3 girls faced the men who'd collaborated in their torture, and their survival became an accusation more powerful than any legal document. "Reverend Whitfield," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute certainty, "told us we were the lucky ones. Said the others in the woods didn't have proper shelter. Said some correction required. Permanent isolation." The admission hung in the basement air like smoke from a mass grave. Other children, other victims, hidden in locations throughout the forest surrounding Millhaven. Some alive, some dead. All forgotten by adults who'd chosen comfort over courage. Case file 3847, DA. Dr. Hayes's final report. March 23rd, 1881, 5:00 a.m. Reverend Whitfield admits to maintaining additional sites for correction throughout the surrounding wilderness. Estimated victim count, unknown but substantial. System of abuse protected by entire town leadership. Millhaven requires intervention by outside authorities. Dr. Hayes made his choice as dawn light filtered through the basement's single window. He would not sign their statement. He would not accept their blood money. He would carry these 3 girls to the county seat at Cookeville, present them to authorities who hadn't been corrupted by Reverend Whitfield's influence, and expose Millhaven's conspiracy of silence to the world. "You're making a terrible mistake," Banker Coleman warned, his voice carrying 40 years of financial authority. "This town won't survive the scandal. The mines will close. Families will lose everything. Is saving 3 troubled girls worth destroying an entire community?" The question revealed the moral bankruptcy that had allowed Millhaven's system to flourish. In their calculation, community reputation mattered more than children's lives. Economic stability justified any cruelty, and collective complicity created shared innocence. Dr. Hayes supported Sarah against his chest, while Emma and Mary flanked him like wounded soldiers preparing for a final battle. Together, they walked toward the basement stairs, past 5 men who represented every institution that should have protected them. Law, religion, government, finance, and justice itself. Power without conscience becomes evil, wearing official uniforms. Behind them, Reverend Whitfield's voice echoed one final time. "Dr. Hayes, you'll never find them all. The woods are vast, and some secrets were buried too deep for digging." The admission confirmed Sarah's whispered revelation. Other victims, other graves, scattered throughout the Cumberland forest in locations only Reverend Whitfield knew. Children who'd asked inconvenient questions and received permanent answers from a man who confused his sadism with divine mission. But as Dr. Hayes carried Sarah toward freedom, she pressed something else into his hand. Not metal this time, but paper, a map she'd drawn during her imprisonment. marking locations she'd glimpsed during brief transports between cells. 23 sites scattered through the woods, each marked with initials and dates spanning 7 years of systematic abuse. What legacy would you leave if you knew death was approaching? Sarah Whitfield spent her final strength creating a treasure map for future rescuers, ensuring that her suffering would guide others toward salvation, even if she didn't survive to see justice delivered. Dr. Hayes reached the basement entrance as full dawn broke over Millhaven, carrying 3 girls whose courage had exposed a town's complicity in evil. Behind him, 5 powerful men faced a choice between covering up their crimes and facing consequences that would destroy everything they'd built on foundations of silence and fear. The story should have ended there, with rescue and exposure and justice finally served. But some evil runs too deep for daylight to reach, and even now, over a century later, travelers through the Cumberland Hills report strange sounds from abandoned mine shafts scratching that follows the rhythm of desperate prayer, and voices that whisper 23 psalms before falling silent forever. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.